Um, Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone, wherever you are. Welcome to the Southeast European Studies Seminar Series. I'm Jelena Ćalić. I teach Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin, Serbian, or BCMS, or BCS, or Serbian/Croatian, or Serbo-Croatian, and some linguistic courses at School of Slavonic and East European Studies at UCL. And I also teach Swedish at the School of European Languages and Cultures, also here at UCL. This is our center's last seminar in the series this academic year. The first seminar was on the rise of the left politics in the region, very much inspired by the changes in the political landscape and ways of political organizing in Southeastern Europe, but equally by emerging social and solidarity movements against ethnic and national discrimination related to language, related to religion, minority rights. So why this seminar? I must say that we haven't had linguistics and the study of language as topics of our seminars that often. And I'm particularly glad that we are rounding off this year's series with a seminar that presents a book which probes the intersection of politics and language. This particular intersection is at the center of the research activity and teaching on our linguistics modules here at School of Slavonic and East European Studies, modules such as languages in contact along the Danube, minority languages of Russia, and discourses of perfection, a module that explores actually standard language ideologies in Eastern Europe from areal and historical perspectives. As you know from the event's announcement, we have gathered here today to discuss the recently published book, Jeziku je svejedno, Language Could Care Less. The PDF of the book is free to download, and I think one of the authors, Anđel Starčević, will post it in the chat, so you will be able to download it for free. The book is the first comprehensive attempt to critically examine the impact of the standard language ideology and other prescriptivist conceptualizations and strategies in the past 30 years in Croatia. The authors stress that language policy and language planning are fundamentally political, and hence it's not acceptable to present language planning as objective and or neutral activity. Quite the opposite, as we can see in the book, language planning that promotes condescending attitude to variation in language and stigmatization of some language forms and varieties is often used to camouflage the stigmatization and exclusion of certain social groups. In their critique of prescriptivism in general, and in Croatia in particular, the authors present a rich corpus of texts and a fascinating range of examples of what is seen as wrong, improper, incorrect language use, and analyze quasi-scholarly arguments to support usage advice on pure and proper Croatian. I have personally enjoyed this aspect of the book the most, and I have learned a lot myself. So I'm very pleased to say that we have the authors of the book with us tonight. So Anđel Starčević, hello Anđel, and Mate Kapović, hello Mate.
Hi everyone.
Hi.
Thank you for being here.
Their colleague Dalibor Kasarić, so one of the authors, unfortunately could not be with us today. We also have our dear colleagues Petar Vuković and Tanja Petrović as books discussants on the panel today. Hello Tanja, hello Petar. I won't introduce our panel in detail, as that would take up too much of our seminar time. You can look up their rich, diverse, and inspiring biographies on our website, and they may be already known to some of you or to all of you. I will introduce our panelists in order of appearance. So first to present is Petar Vuković, linguist from the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, University of Zagreb. Then we will hear Tanja Petrović, anthropologist from Institute of Culture and Memory Studies, Slovene Academy of Sciences and Arts. And then Mate Kapović and Anđel Starčević, authors of Jeziku, svejedno, both linguists and both from the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, University of Zagreb. So just a little bit of housekeeping. The seminar is recorded, so I would ask everyone to turn their microphones off during the talk and to switch their cameras off if they don't wish to appear in the recording, as the video will be published on our school's YouTube channel. We will have a discussion after presentations, and for the Q&A part of the seminar, you can use the raise your hand function on Zoom to ask a question live, or you can post your questions in the chat. And that's all from me. So without further ado, over to Petar. The screen is yours, Petar.
Thank you, Jelena. Hello, everyone. So we are here to talk about the book Language Could Care Less by Anđel Starčević, Mate Kapović, and Dalibor Kasarić. And I would like to tell you something about context to which this book reacts and why I think it is a major breakthrough in Croatian linguistics. Anyway, language standardization has traditionally been a major field of interest in Croatian language studies. However, the topic of standard language has often been approached not with scholarly scrutiny, but with uncritical veneration. And against that background, this book is iconoclastic. In the preface, authors explain that they wrote the book with the intention to carry out a critical analysis of language advice from numerous Croatian usage guides. The analysis was to be preceded by a brief introduction into the basic theory of language standardization. This introduction, however, outgrew the original intention and eventually turned into the focus of the book, encompassing 43 chapters. On the other hand, the analysis of contemporary Croatian prescriptivism is divided into 7 chapters only. Given the ideological burden with which the topic of standard language is approached in Croatia to this day, a thorough insight into the body of knowledge that should be the basis for a linguistic approach to this linguistic variety is necessary. The way this insight is provided in this book, in sharp contrast to what Croatian prescriptivists advocate, gives it the potential to fundamentally shake Croatian standardology. From the very beginning, prescriptivism has deeply influenced Croatian language standardization. In the 19th century, a modern Croatian standard was codified that was actually not spoken by anyone. The language was largely based on the Stokavian dialect, but its grammatical and lexical norm included many elements from the Kajkavian and Shakavian, the other 2 Croatian dialects, which are structurally so different that they could well be considered languages of their own. Moreover, entirely new terminology was built for various disciplines, largely by calquing from Czech or German. And in such a situation, prescriptivism was believed to be the main tool that could help the newly codified standard language to spread among speakers. The social context substantially changed at the end of the 19th century, when the idea that Serbs and Croats should negotiate a common standard language became prominent. Consequently, Croatian standard became more oriented towards Stokavian dialect, which is shared by Serbs and Croats. Usage guides from this period advocated so-called Stokavian purism, and all non-Stokavian language elements were regarded as undesirable. However, since the 1930s, resistance to common standard language gradually increased among Croats. And since then, most language manuals focused on preserving language elements believed to be specifically Croatian. This attitude culminated during the World War II in the fascistic independent state of Croatia, but it gained prominence in the 1960s again. It reached a new peak in the 1990s when the number of prescriptive manuals skyrocketed. However, the target of prescriptivist publications gradually shifted to common usage, which is continually criticized for undermining the idealized and hyper-regulated standard language. Many authors of such publications present what they do as one of the most important applications of the linguistics, and Croatian linguists rarely oppose this view. It is to this situation that the book Language Could Care Less actually reacts. So as I have already said, the first part of the book is an introduction into the basic knowledge of language standardizations. The author repeatedly reminds the readers that linguistics is a descriptive discipline, the task of which is to describe, analyze, and explain various aspects of language system and usage, and by no means to prescribe it. The legitimate subject of linguistics are all the varieties that make up the language repertoire of a community, not just standard language. The fact that in modern nation states the standard language may have a central place is not conditioned by linguistic, but by socio-political factors. After all, the emergence of modern standard languages is connected to the emergence of modern nation states. Circumstances that led to the standard language being based on a certain territorial or social dialect and the very process of its codification are legitimate areas of sociolinguistic research. However, when linguists participate in choosing the dialectal basis of a standard language and formulating codification, they do not do it in the role of an objective scholar, but of a subjective activist. And the two positions should be clearly distinguished. The authors of the book concentrate primarily on what they call post-standard period of Croatian, in which the standard language is not only grammatically, lexically, and orthographically codified, but also stabilized in use. Most members of Croatian linguistic community are able to use standard language reasonably well. However, they usually personalize it, which means that their usage may differ in some ways from the strictly codified norm. This has important consequences for the descriptive approach to standard language. From the perspective of linguistic description, actual use of a language variety is far more relevant than what is claimed about the variety in the literature. In accordance to that, the language standard should not be equated with its explicit codification, but rather sought for in those communicative situations for which standard language is characteristic. Such an approach leads to a better understanding of contemporary standard language, for example, by discovering rules that have not yet been recorded. It can also lead to the improvement of the codification of standard language, for example, by abandoning rules that are not accepted by majority of speakers or by refusing to prescribe rules that the majority of speakers actually implement. The prescriptivist approach substantially differs from descriptive analytical orientation of linguistics. Although often presented as linguistically grounded, prescriptivism actually rests on a set of erroneous simplifications of linguistic reality. The authors of the book mention, for example, belief that the language code is monolithic and immutable, belief that communication can only be successful if it is based on one single code, belief that language varieties and styles should not be mixed, etc. But above all, prescriptivism is underpinned by the ideology of standard language. For example, it is believed that a speaker's relationship to standard language reflects his relationships to his country, to his nation, and cultural tradition. That poor command of standard language can be a reason to deny someone the right to access public space. That without standard language, scientific communication and super-regional communication in general would be impossible, and that even in informal oral communication, speakers should stick to standard language. In addition to being at odds with linguistic reality, prescriptivism also produces harmful psychological and social consequences. Psychological consequences are associated with schizoglossia, condemning all deviations from the rigidly understood codification of standard language, prescriptivist advice can lead to the fear of language and even self-hatred. Under the influence of such advice, speakers evaluate their language production according to prescriptive ideals, and as they are aware that they cannot meet high criteria set by prescriptivists, they develop a negative attitude towards their own language use and reluctantly participate in public communication. Social effects of prescriptivism, on the other hand, are related to the denial of the right to participate in public life to all those who do not meet high standards of language use. This denial is usually connected to the ideological baggage with which prescriptivism is associated, above all ideologies of nationalism, conservatism, and elitism. So prescribing language use that deviates from the hyper-regulated codification of standard language is actually associated with intolerance towards others. So the critique of prescriptivism in this book is formulated on two levels. The first is disciplinarian. The authors point out that linguists have an obligation to warn of misconceptions and mystifications about language and communication on which most prescriptivist publications are based. They emphasize that linguistics, as a descriptive discipline, should be critical of creating communication problems where they do not exist, of prescribing widespread linguistic structures because they do not meet someone's aesthetic or ideological criteria, and of forcible introduction of new language elements to replace the common ones. None of these activities belongs to linguistics, and any attempt to present them as linguistically rounded should be exposed. At a second level, criticism is ethically motivated, and it is associated with the obligation to protect speakers from harmful psychological and social consequences of prescriptivism. In connection to that, the authors admit their ideological stances. They advocate the ideology of pluralism and social equality, as opposed to the conservative authoritarian worldview on which prescriptivism is based. They are inspired by critical linguistics, which aims to reveal mechanisms of manipulation and social domination in language system and language use. With regards to psychological consequences of prescriptivism, the authors emphasize primarily the need to promote linguistic tolerance. Users must have the freedom to choose the variety for themselves, even in public space, and their choices must be tolerated as long as the communication function is not impaired. When it comes to social consequences, the authors oppose the abuse of standard language in stigmatizing individuals and social groups and in cementing social inequality. Standard language cannot be a means of social cohesion if it is primarily a stage for causing insecurity, belittling speakers, and promoting intolerance. In the second part of the book, the authors, as already mentioned, critically analyze contemporary Croatian language prescriptivism. The text of this part is organized into 7 chapters around main ideologies. For example, in connection with the ideology of tradition and immutability, the authors describe the basic mechanisms of formal and semantic changes in language and demonstrate that most prescribed innovations can be explained by perfectly normal language development. In the chapter dedicated to the ideology of standard language and formal style, they argue that it is neither possible nor desirable to use formal language in all situations. Regarding the ideology of the source language, they demonstrate that loan words often adapt to the structure of the recipient language, so it is not possible to insist that they preserve phonological and grammatical features of the source language. One conclusion concerns almost all of the analyzed prescriptivist advice. If one wanted to defend certain linguistic elements as standard, it would be far more reasonable to simply state they are currently part of the explicit codification, instead of trying to provide arguments for them that cannot withstand serious linguistic criticism. Most of the criticism in this book is directed at Croatian practitioners of prescriptivism, who are explicitly called anti-heroes of the book. However, some linguistic authorities, such as Radoslav Katičić and Dalibor Brozović, are also criticized. They serve to demonstrate that even leading linguists can easily succumb to ideology and betray fundamental scholarly principles when they find themselves in the field of standardology. The subject of criticism is also the French prescriptivist tradition, and to a certain extent, the standardological works of the Prague linguistic school. In all these cases, the sharpness of the criticism is further enhanced by the style in which the book is written, despite the fact that it focuses on relatively complex issues. It is not only extremely accessible, but also very witty and playful. Such a style has made the book even more popular outside narrow linguistic audience, but it also contributed to the fact that many readers who identify with the traditional approach to standard language feel not only criticized, but also ridiculed. Many Croatian linguists who have been educated and still work in the spirit of prescriptivism surely feel that way, but also some ordinary speakers who have internalized the ideology of standard language already during their school years. So this book has indeed provoked some defensive reactions, but it has also been welcomed by linguists who were not brought up in the spirit of Croatian prescriptivism, as well as by publicly engaged intellectuals from outside of the linguistic professions, such as writer Jurica Pavičić or physicist Dario Hrupec. Pavičić, for example, states that the inclusive language policy that this book advocates would have a healing effect on Croatian society as a whole, while Hrupec, the physicist, points out that after reading the book, he felt as if he were liberated from the long-term captivity. These two impressive texts point, in my opinion, to one of the main messages of this book. Language, even standard language, belongs to speakers, not to linguists, and especially not to prescriptivists, and it is time for us to finally accept it. The important message is addressed specifically to Croatian standardologists, who are urged to become aware of their prescriptive tendencies and to emancipate themselves from them. I have no doubts that this will eventually happen, as it has already happened in other language communities in Central Europe with strong tradition of prescriptivism. For the time being, we have the book Language Could Care Less to constantly remind us of this goal.
Okay, thank you, Petar. This was very, very detailed and thought-provoking. So we'll leave questions and comments for after Tanja's presentation. So I will ask Anđel and Mate to maybe add or comment. But we will now give floor or the screen to Tanja Petrović.
Thank you, Jelena, and good afternoon. I'm very glad to be here today. Do you hear me? Just to start with usual rituals of today. I was very glad when I was invited to be part of this event, although this is a very intense part of the year, because I read parts of this book before and enjoyed it a lot, and it was a great opportunity to pay it another very close look. For me, when that book arrived, when I was aware of it being published, I somehow experienced that as a very important moment, because in linguistic traditions that shape our region, self-reflective studies and discourses on local linguistic practices are rather rare. And linguistics generally, being it standard language related studies or other studies of other areas of linguistics does not really tend to think of its own practices and produce meta discourses of what linguists do. It's very different. I would say even more broadly, we could claim this, although to much lesser extent, but generally compared, for instance, with anthropology, which is known for being self-reflective very intensely, so intensely that one of the key journals in anthropology is called Critique of Anthropology. So very often what anthropologists do is think of their own practices, criticize it and criticize them and reflect upon them. We find that rarely, especially in nationally shaped disciplines, popularly like named Srbistika, Croatistika, Slovenistika, and so on in the region of former Yugoslavia. So this book basically joins very small number of other studies that try to think of what is happening, to think and explicitly speak of extra linguistic consequences of linguistic academic practices. One of such books, it's already a few years ago when it was published, was Retrolinguistica by Srđan Milošević, I think. I'm sorry, but you can check it. It's also a very critical book about practices of Serbian linguists. Recently, we got Vojko Gorjan's book published in Belgrade, actually, in the 20. vek library, called in Serbian Nije rečnik za seljaka, which critically exposes practices, lexicographic practices of Slovenian lexicographers and terminologists. And there are a few other books. Without any wish of self-advertising, I want to mention my book, Srbija i njen jug, where I spoke on what are extra linguistic consequences of certain ways of studying and writing about dialects of southeastern Serbia. I'm saying this because the point I want to make is actually that, of course, standard language is one, and basically privileged language where linguists feel that they have authority to shape things, to intervene and keep certain state of affairs. But other areas of linguistic study are not empty, not void of having serious political, social, and if you like, also psychological consequences. We just heard that this book, Language Could Care Less, had also very liberating psychological effects on speakers in Croatia. And there are many speakers in need of this kind of liberations also because of workings of linguists in other fields of linguistics. So this book basically is, and the authors say that also in the introduction, is both kind of a textbook with very detailed, very developed discussion on basic linguistic terms that are relevant for the discussion of practices they are exposing in its second part. And this discussion and so many examples they give is really something fascinating and very rich, and also speaking almost enough for itself, because when you read all these examples, I think they are already themselves very illustrative of ideological working of standard practices of standardization and practices driven by standard language ideology. So this really works as a very nice and very important combination, and I will go back to that, But at the moment, I want to bring us back to this idea of having national linguistics and having national fields of research of language, which are actually always more than academic fields. Like working in the field of Croatistica or Srbistica is shaped a bit differently than working in physics in Croatia or in chemistry in Serbia has been understood. There is certain presumption of authority, of having final word, and kind of having the right not to have things imposed from the outside. That would be general discourses. There is this idea of working for the national cause too. So standard language generally, and standard languages also in the area of former Yugoslavia, even more and even more intensely because of the ways Serbo-Croatian went through this path of convergence and divergence in its history, resulting in formation of several simply nationally defined languages. This idea of national language and work for the national cause is very, very important. And that in a way also shapes the ideology of standard language, as standard language has been simultaneously seen, as we heard also today, as something inevitably artificial on one side, something which is product of consensus, unnatural product basically, but necessary one. And on the other hand, something as actually very natural and organic, something that has its own rules of development. And we could hear so much about that, and we still can hear, because at the moment in Serbia, there is a huge and very intense discussion about the law regulating gender equality, which also in a very neutral way prescribes that gender-sensitive language should be used in public institutions and media. But that is really intensely and very strongly perceived as in very also organic metaphors as raping the language, misshaping the language, imposing something from the outside. Although, of course, quite few of these forms that suggest language-sensitive use have already been in use for a long time, and in certain periods were very intensely in use for that matter. So there is nothing very new about that. And also at this moment, there are so many users of Serbian who use this gender-sensitive forms, but nevertheless, that is seen as really touching and distorting the very nature of the Serbian language, which has its own way of developing, and no one should anyhow intervene in that, except from those involved in standardization. Of course, they have that authority, and there is a strong idea that this authority is given to these people by the national community, and there is an accord and consensus between the community and committees for standardization, people at the Academy of Science, or whoever actually has this role in the society. So this is definitely part of the nation building, something which is seen as a product of common interest and accord in agreement is in what should be done and who has authority to do that. So these reflective studies or discourses about linguistic practices, basically practices by linguists, I'm implying here, not practices by speakers themselves, are always met with some, basically are seen as an unpleasant surprise, something which should not be there, something which is not okay. And I'm sure, and I could see that the authors of the book we are talking about today are seen in a way as villains in Croatia. When I published my book, I was seen as, someone who used to be our linguist, and now I live in Slovenia, so I sold myself to someone else. So discourse of strani plaćenici is very often present here, and a lot of emotional kind of charge and emotionally expressed feelings of betrayal and so on. So this is already something very, I would say, symptomatic, that it's impossible to talk about these things without a lot of emotions, even when it comes to, of course, to the language standard around which we more or less agree that it should be a neutral means of public communication. Another reaction to this kind of writing is also that it's not scientific, or it is political and activist. So this strong insistence of dividing the two fields of acting. On one hand, we, as linguists, as Croatists, Serbianists, Slovenists, or so what's on, we are working in scholarly field, and any attempt to reflect about this very practice in which we work is nothing but politics or activism, is something which I find very important. Is something actually I want to spend a few minutes on, because I think that is something also very symptomatic and relevant if we try to ask a broader question, and that is why the books as the one we discussed today is important, not only for the field of linguistics in a respective national community in Croatia in this case, and not only for linguistics and linguistic theory itself, but also why it is really socially and politically important, why we need this kind of books, and why they are much, much more than teasing mainstream linguistic practices by authorities in the field. Authors of this book make very important intervention, putting activists, linguistic activism, as they say, and insisting on it in the heart of what they are doing, and at the same time like contextualizing their own discussion into very hardcore linguistic theory. So they don't accept being activists in only political sense, that they are outside of the field of knowledge production is in strictly scholarly terms. And I think that's very important. And they say, and that's something I really want to emphasize as extremely important point, that actually the tasks and the obligation of linguists who see themselves as activists, but I would say that any linguist who sees themselves as scholars should have the same ambition and duty, basically, is to warn and point out to those academic practices, scholarly practices that cause discrimination, feelings of being second-class citizens, insecurity of certain parts of citizens and so on. So all these non-linguistic consequences, seemingly purely academic or scholarly ways of dealing with language have. And this is why the setup of this book, which basically provides a lot of linguistic theory also, and is thus suitable also for people who don't have linguistics and or didn't have it as their major during their studies, and who are not linguistic experts. They make linguistic theory rather comprehensible and intelligible also for this kind of readers, but they insist on putting each phenomena they study, being it language ideologies related to standard idiom, purism, linguistic nationalism, and so on, into these very elaborated linguistic theories, elaborated, of course, in the international arena, where discourses of clearly nationally defined linguistic disciplines does not actually mean much and does not also make sense, I would say. So this is something I want to really point out as a very important intervention. So not trying to, although the authors very consistently insist that what they do is based on scientific evidence and coming from academic research, so they never step out of their role of being linguists themselves and being experts in the field. At the same time, they embrace linguistic activism as something what actually linguists themselves are supposed to do. And this, the bridging this way, or transcending the division between scientific and political here, which is in heart of many authority-driven legitimization practices of standardization and prescriptivism, is essentially important. And maybe I will simply end with maybe posing the question, or opening a question for thinking of what, on the other hand, on the other hand, of course, while I totally understand why it's so important to rely and insist on authors' own academic authority, on the importance of their voice coming from the expertise and speaking as someone having authority within this expertise, my question would be, is that the only way to speak of these things and to bring them into broader debates? Can we speak about what's happening not only with language, but with speaker of the language, with linguistic communities, without making this ping pong of who has more expert authority when it comes to language? What's the way to open this discussion also to speakers themselves, to, after all, their feelings, their needs? I mean, the question is not new, it's not only mine. We had the very similar question discussing a few years ago, declaration of the common language, and some of you would recall this debate. But basically, the question how to make legitimate, academically legitimate, also what language interventions, linguist interventions on language do to speaker, how these interventions reduce possibilities of their political and social acting and being, is something which we need to bring into debates of that does not privilege linguistic expertise and does not make it one of the main arguments of both sides, I would say. So I will finish here and maybe we can discuss it later.
Thank you, Tanja. Thank you for another very rich and very thought-provoking presentation, and thank you for posing that question at the end. Again, I also have quite a lot of questions, but I'm quite aware of the time as well, and I also want to invite Anđel and Mate to comment on your presentations of their book and the questions that the book raises. So Anđel and Mate, your comments, and maybe if you would want to add to what has been said already, maybe highlight some other aspects of the book that haven't been mentioned so far. So over to you.
Okay, so Hi, my name is Kapović. I'm one of the authors, and I'll just say a few words. I would like to thank, of course, the organizers, Jelena and the others, and of course to Tanja and Petar for giving their great introductions. I think they've really said a lot about the book and the context in general. So I will just speak on a couple of points. First, I have to say that writing this book was actually, well, it was fun, obviously, but also it was at the same time frustrating because at many times it seemed that the topic was at once both banal and very complex. What do I mean by that is banal because, as we state somewhere in the beginning of the book, actually what we had to do was kind of write an introduction to linguistics, because many of the stuff we try to explain in the book are actually, it's actually basic linguistic theory. It's, the basics of language and linguistics, and that linguistics is descriptive, and that language is not about having moral stances which are not founded on how to speak properly, and that one word or one meaning is bad or wrong or proper or correct and so on. So it's, that's basically just linguistics and, foundations of linguistics. So in that regard, it was really ridiculous that, a very big part, a very big chunk of the book is basically, it's what we talk about is actually basics of linguistics, and then people, the people who criticize the book, they say, oh no, you're anarchists, you are, I don't know, you're against language, against the state, and so on. It seems very extreme and radical to them, and it's just basic linguistics. So it's very strange, and it's very sad in some ways, because it's like what we get not only in Croatia and actually Yugoslavia, but in many countries around the world, especially in outside of the academic circle, is basically that instead of astronomy, you get astrology. So this is what we get concerning language, and it's really difficult to discuss that. And on the other hand, while being banal from one perspective, it's also quite complex, because when you actually get in some specific topics and specific problems, it actually gets rather complicated. Because, for instance, I can just name one thing that I found very interesting is when you speak about this prescriptivism, and then how one should not, how linguistics does not correct language, does not say that some words, meanings, forms are bad and others are correct. It's interesting to we have a chapter in the book where we connect this to the prescriptivism in language to ideas on terminology and ideology in language, where, for instance, you can say that, of course, the SSEES dictum that you can say anything in, any kind of meaning can be expressed by any kind of word in a language, because language is basically there's nothing inherent in it, so it's depending on the context, and just depends on how people actually speak. But if we talk about, for instance, about ideology in language, then we get, for instance, if we talk about freedom or capitalism or socialism or whatever, there you can have, oh no, it's there's a lot of discussions there that look like prescriptivism, because it says, no, that's not really freedom, no, that's not really capitalism, capitalism should mean this, socialism should mean this, I don't know, human rights should mean this. And it is really complex to try to disentangle these different concepts. So what is prescriptivism and what is, I don't know, discussion about concepts, which are concepts that are expressed in words, but this is not a discussion about words themselves, but about ideas, which are expressed through language. So it was stuff like that was quite complex and interesting. The book itself, I think it's what was also interesting to me is that it's not only social linguistics, not only language policy, but it was all. There's also part of it that is a lot of it is actually and this was one of the things I did in the book among others, being a comparative linguist and historical linguist and a dialectologist, because a lot of the prescriptivism and the ideology of standard language is often connected to the idea of language decay. So, well, what many people, linguists and non-linguists, think that language decays as it gets older. So people used to speak much better 100 years ago and 200 years ago, just the way that people were, they were much more polite before and so on, this myth of golden age. So it was really interesting we didn't want to just say, because from a perspective of like theoretical linguistics, you can just say, no, it doesn't matter what the history of a word or a form or a meaning is, or how it's spoken in different dialects and so on. It's not important, because we know that even if a word has its roots only in like last year, if people use it, it's just as valuable as any other word in language. For instance, some words that was inherited from Proto-European 6,000 years ago. But however, we didn't want to just say, well, the etymology doesn't matter, history doesn't matter, don't matter. We actually wanted to discuss also these things to explain how these prescriptivists actually misuse the data, often don't know the data, and they speak about the language, and they supposedly love the language, their own language very much, but they're very often not really experts when it comes to language itself. They don't know the history. For instance, they prefer older words, older meanings, older forms, but they actually don't know how people used to speak in the past, and then they don't know what is actually in the dialect. So a part of the book is also dedicated to explaining some things about the history of certain forms and words and forms used in the dialects and so on. So that was also very, very interesting, at least to me. So I think if a reader can also find stuff like that in the book, it's not just social linguistic theory and denouncement of prescriptivism. I think that was also important. So one could ask, what was the point? What were our goals when we wrote the book? And in many ways, as we say in the book, what we wanted to do was to write a book that was the book we would have liked to had an opportunity to read back like 15 or 20 years ago, when we were just kids trying to get involved with linguistics. And I think in many ways we have succeeded, and we just wanted to have a book that would enable young linguists, because for many of the people who are deeply, as Petar said, who have deeply internalized this prescriptivist logic in language, it's difficult to expect for them to change their mind. So we wanted to give something to young linguists and also to the general public. And I think we have actually succeeded in this in many regards, because a lot of people were very pleased with the book and the ideas in it. But of course, it's very difficult to expect major changes, because I think Tanja mentioned the idea of the standard language is intricately, it's inherently related to the national state itself. So if we have the national state, if we live in a system, in a social system we live in, it's very difficult to, I mean, it's impossible to expect for language to be much different than politics and society in general. So of course we understand that, but there are also some like minor goals, like some kind of, let's say, transitional program. For instance, what we want to do is to achieve something that is, I think, already achieved in the Anglosphere, in the English-speaking countries like Britain and the US, where there's of course a lot of prescriptivism in general public and in the media and so on, and in general perception. But in academia itself, among linguists, it's among professional linguists, it's not, it's frowned upon. So it's not considered. It's not considered proper for linguists to have such views. And what we want to do is in Croatia and maybe in the wider region in ex-Yugoslavia to try to get rid of prescriptivism as an unscientific view on language, to just get it out of the university and of the language institutes and so on. So, and I think maybe I'm a bit of an optimist in that regard, but I think in maybe like 20 or 30 or 50 years, I think it will be much better in that regard. And I think that we have already made quite a lot of progress. For instance, in Croatia, we had some kind of a shift here, because after the publication of our book, the person who actually kind of became a new public face, new academic public face for prescriptivism, or at least for some kind of more traditional perspective on language, is Ranko Matasović. He's actually my old boss and my colleague from the same department. We actually sit in the same office at our faculty, because we're both on the chair of comparative linguistics, comparative and historical linguistics at the Department of Linguistics. And the good thing about that, I mean, he's conservative and nationalist, and he likes the tradition, and he likes to have he wants to have like a firm standard dialect and so on and so on. But he's all of that, but he's also otherwise a very serious linguist. He's basically an Indo-Europeanist and typologist, so he's not somebody who will say crazy things like some other very popular prescriptivists in Croatia, for instance. He's a serious linguist who knows what grammaticalization is, who knows that language changes and it has to change, because he's a historical linguist. He doesn't, he knows what he doesn't believe that language can be without metaphors or metonymies and so on. So he actually agrees with us in many of the basic things, because he's just a linguist, and he knows that whatever his political views are, he can't go against some these basics of linguistics. So we can disagree politically and in some interpretations and what we want for language to look like in Croatia and so on. But he is a serious linguist after all. So I think him becoming a sort of a public face for this new prescriptivism in Croatia, we'll have in autumn. He will also organize one academic discussion on the problems of standardization of language, and Anđel and I will also be there with prescriptivists, with other prescriptivists from Croatia. So I think it's this is, for instance, one of the major, I think, major accomplishments by the book. And I mean, it's not just the book, because Anđel and me and Dalibor, we were in in the media a lot, and we discussed it all around Croatia before the Corona crisis. We spoke at a lot of the conferences and public discussions and so on in Croatia, so it was also publicly present a lot. And I think it's a big accomplishment that at least, you know, the opposing side, the traditional conservative side, is much more reasonable now than it used to be before, because people who are you know, are regarded as the most important prescriptivists before the book, or before, you know, the recent events, were much worse than Ranko Matasović. So I think that's also one big accomplishment. And in the end, I think I can comment on what Bojan Bujić said in the comments, perhaps. So there's a question that in both Croatian and Serbian, correctness has seemed to be so it's connected to intelligibility, and because what they say is, ideologically, they say that, oh no, we have to speak, you know, the correct, the proper standard dialect, because it's just, you know, it's not that we want to, you know, push other people how they have to speak and what is proper, but it's just that we want to, you know, we want to be more intelligible, and it's easier to understand, and so on, and stuff like that, which is I just wrote about that in my response to Matasovic's criticism of our book in one of Croatian linguistic journals, where I pointed to a couple of examples where you can just find that if you want to look, for instance, some forms in the standard dialect and in dialects, you can find forms which are somehow more clear in a way that, for instance, you have I don't know, you have different forms, for instance, for nominative and accusative. For instance, speakers of BCMFs will know that, for instance, if you have in certain words, for instance, if in masculine words which are non-animate, the accusative is identical to the nominative. And if you want to look for from this kind of functionalist perspective, you can say that it's more intelligible if the accusative is different from the nominative. But what you get is actually it's not always the case that for instance, different cases are more distinct in the standard language. Sometimes they are, for instance, when spoken language has innovated, but sometimes they're not, because in many cases, the dialects actually have more archaic or more diverse forms. So it's not intelligibility and more clear ways of expressing something, for instance, differing nominative from accusative. It's not a matter of prescriptivism in standard language. It just depends. Different codes are different, and sometimes the dialects are clearer in some ways, and sometimes the standard dialect is clearer. So this is, I think, important to note, because this is just an ideological misconception. Okay, so I think I can stop here because I've already talked a lot, and Anđel is here, and I think he will.
Okay, so I'm back. Sorry about this. I don't know. My computer just froze. Anyway, so I think since Petar and Tanja talked about this whole issue from a more theoretical perspective, I thought perhaps it might be interesting to perhaps share some examples, if that's okay. So can you see the presentation? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
We just need to be aware of the time as well, and leave some time for questions from the audience as well.
Great. Okay, so I'll just go briefly through some of these ideologies and some of the examples. Okay, so some of the ideologies that we established in our corpus or in our various corpora is, for example, monocodia, or the monocodal ideology. This idea that only one code is needed. Only one code is needed for successful communication. For example, or there's another related ideology that's very close to this idea, this ideology of constant standard language use. this idea that we're supposed to use the standard dialect in all situations because we only basically need one code, and the standard dialect is very often portrayed as the most precise, the most elegant, the best code, etc. Right? So another ideology is the monosemonymic ideology or monosemonymy, which is a combination of monosemy and mononymy. In other words, this idea that it's an old idea in prescriptivism, in language planning, that one form should only have one meaning, and vice versa, that one meaning should only be expressed by using a single form, not several forms. Okay. Another ideology, another strong ideology is the monoglossic ideology or monoglossia. Okay, so codes should not be mixed. You should use one code at a time. Okay, so if you're speaking English, you should stick to English. I don't have anything against French or Croatian, people say, but you know, if it's Croatian, it should be only Croatian, right? The mono original ideology or mono originy. So all forms or all meanings, all morphemes, for example, should be of one native origin. And finally, the monoverbal ideology or monoverbia, disturbia, which is this idea that one word is in fact better than a phrase. Okay, so a single word is a better expression of a certain idea because it saves energy. It's better to have a single expression, a single word, than multiple words or a phrase to express an idea, right? So this is also an ideology we find in this type of prescriptivism. There's another, so perhaps we can skip this. If you're interested, you can also take a look at our criticism of the most or the best known definition of the standard language in Croatian studies. We talked about this in the book, but since we're kind of short on time, perhaps I can move on to some other examples. So for example, the ideology of the standard language, this is something we see in, for example, textbooks as well. This is from another study that I carried out with another colleague from our faculty, Sanda Lucia Udir. And for example, in one of Croatian language textbooks for I think this is elementary school, they offer this schematic representation of Croatian. So we have the standard language here, and then the Croatian language here, the language of literature, colloquial language, local dialect, regional dialect, major dialect. In Croatian, we have 3 major dialects, right? So if you take a look at this diagram or this representation, we see that it's very ideological. I would say that it's actually surprisingly ideological because the superimposed term or the superimposed concept here is that of the standard language, right? So the standard language seems to be more important than the Croatian language as such. Okay, so this is just one example of implicit ideological representation in, for example, textbooks, right? Or, for example, the monoglossic ideology. This is from a usage guide published by Croatian Radio Television. They say, well, you know, the noun thief is a Hungarian word, and the suffix luk is Turkish, which is why lopovluk, a combination of these 2 elements, is therefore a linguistic freak or a linguistic or a language abomination. Jezična nakaza, they say in Croatian, right? Because we're not supposed to combine elements from different languages. Or, for example, another one. Okay, yeah, okay, I'll skip this one. Or, for example, the ideology of tradition. So you're not supposed to say originalan, you're supposed to say originalan because the etymology is original. So you're not supposed to drop vowels in such words. Okay, so the ideology of tradition, older forms are supposed to be better, more correct, more proper. Instead of govoriti, to speak English, govoriti engleski, people very often say pričati engleski. Okay, this is a more recent development, and this is why a lot of people say, you know, this is wrong. Also, there's this Serbian connection, this idea that it's somehow derived from Serbian. So again, it's not something that should be endorsed in Croatian. The ideology of monosemonymy that I've already mentioned. One form should be connected to only one meaning, and one meaning should be expressed by using only one form. This is how we can be precise in language. This is how language can be rendered or can be rendered or made more precise. In order to achieve this ideal of monosemonymy, 2 different strategies are used, or 2 different procedures are used. Monosemic and mononymic erasure, for example, if there's more than one meaning to a certain form, monosemic erasure is carried out. So in order to achieve this one meaning per form, so predstavlja, to represent, is supposed to mean only to present something, to present a book, but not it's not supposed to be used in the meaning of to be. Okay, a lot of people say this is a problem, this poses a problem, so this meaning of B is not wanted, and monosemic erasure is typically carried out. The opposite scenario is mononymic erasure. For example, we have several words for towel in Croatian: ručnik, ručnik, šugaman, peškir, and then šugaman and peškir are supposed to be foreign influences. This is why they're again not wanted, and mononymic erasure is supposed to be carried out so that we only have one form, ručnik, for this particular meaning. The ideology of monoverby. So one word is better than a phrase. Naplatna kućica. Well, you know, people say naplatna kućica for toll booth, but in fact, naplatnica is offered as a better solution because it's a single word. It's supposed to save speakers energy, right? Although no one talks about the energy you need to to consume in order to remember that in fact this element will save your energy, right? So again, this is all pseudo science and pseudo scholarship. The monocodal ideology or monocodia, another example that we found in our study with Santa Lucia Udir, our study of textbooks for Croatian as L1 as the people's first language. So it says here, underline in the boy's thoughts the unnecessary foreign words which are part of private communication. Okay, so if this is not 1984, what is? Okay, so underline the unnecessary foreign words in someone's thoughts. Okay, and this is obvious, and they're explicit about these examples being part of someone's private communication, or even, you know, it's actually more than just private communication. It's actually private thoughts. Okay, so we're supposed to correct other people's thoughts. Correction practices are portrayed as positive, as something that we should encourage, something we should do, something that we should definitely accept. Okay, and then, the etymological fallacy is also present. The ideology of the source language, various examples. Perhaps the most interesting here, the most interesting example here is Kava bonus. So bonus coffee. So bonus is this brand. You're not supposed to say Kava bonus because Kava is feminine. So the noun Kava is feminine in Croatian, which is why the brand or the name should be Kava bona. Okay, speakers of Croatian will appreciate this this in joke. You're not supposed to say pomfrit or pomfrit. You're supposed to say pomfrit because in French we say pomfrit. Okay, so this is now the ideology of the source language. The ideology of discrete, literal, and metaphorical meanings. It's a huge pseudo problem if you use various prepositions, or if you use various prepositions with extended meanings, with metaphorical meanings. Okay, so iza means behind. You're not supposed to use iza to mean after. Okay, although we know that time is typically conceptualized as space, so there's no problem. But very often people insist on separating the literal and the metaphorical meaning of a certain preposition. The ideology of zero redundancy. Okay, if you say oko dvadesetak, you're not supposed to say it because dvadesetak on its own already means around 20. So oko dvadesetak is redundant. It's too much. We're not supposed to use it. But on the other hand, if there's no redundancy in language, for example, sa ili bez šlaga, with or without cream, this is supposed to be wrong because these prepositions, with or without, require different cases in Croatian. Which is why we have to make the noun explicit as well. So people say sa ili bez šlaga, there's no redundancy here, but now the same people insist on inserting or adding redundancy and using redundant expressions, which are actually not favored by the average speaker, right? So we're supposed to add redundancy where there's none, and vice versa, right? The ideology of formal symmetry. If a good colleague is masculine in the singular, it should also be masculine in the plural. So dobri kolege, although a lot of people say dobre kolege, they make the form agree. So they use the feminine form as well for male reference. But this ideology of formal symmetry is again present because we're supposed to be consistent. This is what they say on Croatian radio. The ideology of formal style. We should choose the best. These expressions, they say, belong in the colloquial style. They should stay there. Okay, so do not succumb to the mostly ignorant majority. Stick to the correct forms. Leave various shizike to the colloquial style again. And finally, what are some of the social consequences of such ideologies or the promotion of such ideologies? Linguistic insecurity, linguistic self-hatred, schizoglassia, which has already been mentioned, And also we can conclude that the prescriptivists generally present their work or present themselves as language brokers, people who are there to help you with your language production, but in fact, they come off as language breakers, okay? They in fact come off as language breakers, jezični odmagači, so they present themselves as jezični pomagači, language helpers, but in fact, we think that they're actually language breakers, jezični odmagači, because they demotivate you from speaking one of your languages through their constant criticism, allegedly in the name of science. Okay, what we believe we should actually do in the Croatian public sphere is increase the promotion of linguistically substantiated ideas in schools and in the media for a better informed public debate. We should focus. We should turn our focus in language policy and planning back to the speaker, to the average speaker. We should bear in mind that that everyone actually uses what we refer to as a personalized standard. So we all speak in slightly or radically different ways. We all use, even if we use the standard dialect, various standard dialects in various languages, we typically use a personalized standard of that language, which is the result of a unique order and matter of acquisition of various languages, dialects, styles, and varieties, which is also the result of a unique contact of these codes in each speaker's mental system. And finally, this personalized standard is the result of the speaker's individual metapragmatic ability and wish to control or not to control the overlapping so the overlapping of codes in various domains of use, and or for example to control the compartmentalization of codes in various domains of use. There are some features in our production that we can actually control. There are some other features that we cannot control. Sometimes we do not want to control them. We think that code switching is appropriate in certain situations. Sometimes we think that a more monolingual production is more suitable, etc. So this is again what we believe should be our focus in language policy and planning: a personalized standard, or the personalized standard of each individual speaker. To conclude,
you have to stop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm done in 30 seconds. Okay, so in order to I think this is what we need to do in order to achieve less of this type of situation, okay, and more of this. We need to focus on individual speakers, on the average speaker, and the way that individual speakers can fantastically juggle different languages, dialects, styles, codes, and we should, I think, we appreciate the linguistic facets of diversity in human behavior. I'm done.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for both yours and Mate for your input as well. Fascinating, and thank you for presenting some of the examples, and Mate for answering that question from the chat. Now I open the floor to the audience. Any questions from the audience for our panelists? Raise your hand or wave to us. Anyone? Bojan Bujic.
Bojan Bujic, Magdalen College, Oxford. I'm not a linguist, yet I am a linguist, as you know, because I speak more than one language, and therefore in English parlance, I am a linguist. I'm a good linguist, but I am not a linguistician. This shows us to what extent, in fact, the communication is subject to very fine nuances of words and their meanings. And whether we want it or not, most of our communication, say in the scholarly world and indeed in consuming the literature, the belles lettres, is through the written word. So to what extent the speakers that have presented their arguments so far acknowledge something that is, after all, reducible to what I think rhetoricians call registers: high, neutral, and low, because you were speaking always as if all these registers are infused with each other, completely congealed together, whereas they're not. Not necessarily is this a sign of linguistic either prescriptivism or not, but essentially of the need to be what I pointed out in that little message, correctness versus, I would say, not so much even intelligibility, but a clarity of presentation. Because as everybody knows, who, for my sins, like anybody else, has tried to translate from the Croatian into English, you first feel that you need to rewrite the Croatian into something that is, as it were, stylistically elegant. Now, who am I to say what is stylistically elegant? Well, stylistically elegant is that what lends itself to a certain logical construction, whether it is expressed in one language or another. What are the thoughts of the participants on this, coming from a very enthusiastic amateur?
Well, can I start? Can I just say something? Yeah. Okay. So I think that, so you talked about various styles being yeah, you talked about various styles being presented perhaps as being congealed. That's what you said, right? Okay. So on the other hand, I would also say that styles are definitely not discrete. Okay, they're very often presented as discrete. So informal, formal. Okay, they're very often presented in binary, or even as binaries, or as perhaps scales. Okay, but on the other hand, I think that we need to bear in mind the fact that very often styles are, there's a continuum, there's a stylistic continuum in our production, right? So that's one point. And another point is that I would say that various situations where a more formal type of language used to be used in the past have now changed to such situations where a more informal type of language is allowed and is not considered to be impolite, rude, or inappropriate. Okay, I would say that in many situations, on many different occasions, we can now use a more informal type of language than perhaps used to be the case many years ago. So just. Yeah.
There is a danger which we, for instance, in this country are facing, and that is that people a la Boris Johnson are exactly playing that card by saying I am the man of the people, and he will introduce colloquialism, etc., in order to put across a certain linguistic machination, obfuscation, or whatever, because he will be instinctively and emotionally understood on a certain level. And this is what populist leaders have always banked on and felt confident with.
Thank you.
And this is the danger.
Thank you, Bojan, for that question. It's something that we discussed earlier, and I think it kind of links also to the question that Tanja ended her presentation with, and that is how do we reach the speaker? How do we treat the speaker? And we see this, what you have just mentioned, this appropriation of the informal and spoken and colloquial, often by the right-wing media and the tabloids. So the politically conservative is not necessarily linked to prescriptivism and to the use of standard. So we see a shift here as well. So we can ask the panelists to comment on that. But I have a question in the chat from Eric Gordy. Could the author say a bit about political responses to the Declaration on Common Language?
Yeah, so the Declaration of Common Language was a declaration offered a couple of years ago, where people from around ex-Yugoslavia made a declaration basically saying that enough with the nationalist politics. We think that Croatian, Serbian, Bosnian, and Montenegrin is actually one language. What were their responses? Well, the responses were, of course, negative. For instance, in Croatia, well, it was not maybe such a big deal because it was just that, you know, a couple of politicians said, well, we don't care, Croatian is Croatian, this is nonsense. Croatian Academy of Sciences also said that, and a couple of linguists said the usual nationalist line that it's you know, it's what they're saying is wrong. It's Croatian is its own language and so on. So it's just what one would expect. I think it's nothing usual. What I can say from my personal perspective, I did not sign the declaration because I had some problems with it. Both on factual and tactical, ideological, political perspective. First of all, I didn't actually agree. I mean, of course I support the basic anti-nationalist gist of it. So politically, the basic idea of the declaration, I agree with it, of course, because I do not agree with the nationalist tendencies in post-Yugoslav countries in general and in language as well. However, I think that the wording of the declaration is a bit problematic because it's in my view, if I were not a linguist, and especially not a linguist who does social linguistics, I would perhaps sign it, but I couldn't sign it because it was, for instance, when they tried to explain that Croatian, Serbian, Bosnian, Montenegrin are one language, the other examples from world languages they present are, different varieties of German and of, I don't know, Portuguese and English and French, like in Quebec and France, or in the US and Britain and so on, which is, of course, completely legitimate because basically of course, the history is different, but basically Croatian and Serbian are just like British English and American English. It's very, very similar, or Austrian, German, and German. So it's of course similar, but if we want to be, intellectually honest, one should also name. I mean, being a linguist, I cannot just, overlook. Although I am, anti-nationalist. I'm inclined in such an anti-nationalist perspective. I cannot just say that our case is very different from what we get in the world, for instance, because it's one thing to say that, standard dialect in Croatia and Serbia is basically just these are basically varieties of one, pluricentric standard dialect, like with English. That's of course completely correct, and that's what I always say when they ask me in Croatia what are Croatian and Serbian. That is what I always say. It's like the standard dialect is like in Britain and in the US. However, one should also note that the situation we had prior to 1990, when it was generally held by the public in general and by the linguists in academia, was that it was one language, and then after 1990 it was like 2 and 3 and 4 languages. The basic reality remained the same. I mean, the languages have changed a bit, but not really a lot, and basically it's just the perception that has changed after the political changes and the rise of nationalism and so on. So, but this is the linguistic reality is one thing, and names of languages or language is another thing. For instance, you have a very similar case with Croatian and Serbian in Pakistan and India with Hindi and Urdu, which are also basically just varieties of the same standard dialect, but they also have different names. They have Hindi and Urdu. Sometimes you can say Hindustani, but it's not really used much, especially inside of linguistics. And it's basically, you can say it's just two varieties of same pluricentric language, but you have two names. So I think one should be aware. We should not try to hide that sometimes, even if you say that something is basically the same language, you can have two different names for it, because names, it's what we say in linguistics is that a language is a dialect with a navy and an army, which is basically correct. And this is actually what you have in Croatia. We have a navy and an army, and the people or the dominant politics, they want to have a separate language, and it doesn't change the linguistic reality, but it is what it is. And I think if we want to fight to have a common language, what one should do is first we should deal with it in politics and not in language, because language is actually just a reflection of a wider political differences and opinions in politics. So if we want to say that we have something common, you should fight nationalism in politics, and only then can you fight really in a productive way nationalism in language, because language reflects politics and not vice versa. Language is a superstructure and not the basis.
Mate, thank you. And we have a question from Tanja, or a comment.
No, it's not a question. It's more the follow-up. I wanted to say something about actually both issues we touched upon here. I think, of course, that populist politics and media address and focus on and build their popularity on the colloquial of the marginal. That's per definition what populism does. And we know that in case of Donald Trump, he simply, this kind of moral outrage after his victory in 2016 failed to recognize that victory was also a consequence of the fact that of very negligent and paternalistic and mocking attitude of elites towards those who felt marginalized. And that's always what populism does. And although there are also other aspects here, I think the main question is how populism, what linguistics, standardization and political practices bring colloquial, dialectal, vernacular, connected with the margin. And then that margin is, of course, target of populism, which I would say is a rather universal mechanism. And regarding a declaration, I agree with Mate, but and basically I agree with you totally, but I would not say of course, the name is not a matter itself, but exactly as you said, the politics is what matters here. And now, after 4 years after declaration, I can say that we can safely argue that the problem with the declaration was that it was so careful and so kind of eager to avoid the politics and not to talk about politics. And again, I finish with that to stick to linguistic arguments as a way to legitimize the very claim that it's one language. But the very idea of declaration started in politics itself and in places where the name is not only the name, and that's Bosnia, where actually this idea of the national or ethnic identity as the only one people can subscribe to totally freezes any possibility of political action outside ethnic groups. And basically there is no functioning state there for a long time, also in terms of language, also in terms of everything. So basically there we see why these are very political claims. And in my view, that declaration and its authors have to be more politically overt about consequences of this seemingly nice idea of, okay, we don't want to touch your national feelings. Of course, it's fine to call, but let's agree it's one language. Of course, it's one language. I think that's clear to everyone. But actually, political and social consequences also language policies in these countries, especially for some people and especially in some places, have very, very disastrous, very palpable consequences. And that's why I think the project failed, because it was too gentle and too cautious not to be activist in that sense, but to stay in nice frame of political correctness and social linguistic arguments or linguistic arguments.
Thank you very much, Tanja. Again, any more questions or comments from the audience? Okay, if there are no more questions or comments or suggestions, I will end today's seminar. I will say thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the audience. This was great. Thank you for coming. And as we said at the beginning, you can download the free copy of the book. I think Anđel sent a link. Read the book, enjoy it, and hopefully see you in some of our seminars next academic year. So stay tuned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for inviting us, and a huge thank you to everyone for being here and attending the seminar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.